In the last section, we talked about how to place your subject within the frame. In this section, we're going to talk about how lenses change the look of your frame. When you use different lenses, different focal lengths from wide to telephoto, it drastically changes the way your images will appear within the frame. Now, typically, when most people get started, they think that the lens is a way to choose your subject matter. So here I'm standing on a bridge and I'm using a wide-angle lens and I can see down into the river. And as I lengthen my lens, my view gets smaller and smaller. And that's typically what you would think when you're changing your longer lenses, until you get way out and you're just in on the falls. But the truth of the matter is that if you actually change your position and then change your lens, you can keep the object or your main subject the same size, and everything around it is going to change. So let's look at the angle of view. Here is our subject that we don't want to change in size, and we're using a normal lens. Well, the normal lens has got an angle of view. And in this case, you're going to see this much background surrounding your main subject. Now, if you were to use a longer lens, and again frame up the subject, the main subject, at the same size, look at how much less background you're actually getting. So what's occurring is that when you use a longer lens, you're getting less background and it becomes bigger. When you're using a normal lens, you get more background and it becomes smaller. Lenses are truly one of the most important tools that a photographer has. And the reason is unlike painters, we can't imagine ourselves being in a different position or having the weather be different or having the model not blink. So the lens themselves are one of the few ways that we can actually change the look of what we're seeing. We can't imagine it in our head. It's got to be changed with the lenses. So let's look at it a different way. When you take your main subject and you're using a wide-angle lens, there's this much framing around it. When you're doing the same thing with a long lens, you can see how much less background you're getting. Okay, so let's check out the attributes of wide-angle lenses. First, they exaggerate the size of the foreground. Next, they include more background while making it appear smaller. They create an illusion of greater than normal expanse. They sort of stretch the scene out. And inherently, they have a very deep depth of field. So even if you're at 5.6 or f8, chances are you're going to be able to get everything very, very sharp. Let's begin with the exaggeration of the foreground. Look at this century plant. Because I'm close to this plant and I'm using a wide-angle lens, it seems very, very large in comparison to the mountain in the background. That's what a wide-angle lens will do. But remember, you've got to get close to your main subject in order to get this effect. Here as well, I'm basically standing right on top of these leaves, and you can see how everything is splaying out in the background. The leaves become very large. Really wide-angle lenses can actually distort your view. Obviously, this brick building wasn't built this way, but the wide-angle lens, because it's so wide, I believe this is like a 12mm lens, and I'm very close, you're starting to get this bending. And that can occur with really wide-angle lenses. It's exaggerating the foreground. Now, if you don't get too very close to the subject, then you don't get that exaggerated foreground. So here, this is an enormous tree, but because I'm very far away from it, everything looks to be about normal. Same thing here. This is a very large rock structure in the water and a very small plant, and they seem to have the same or normal relationship between the two. Again, it's because I'm not close to this plant. I'm probably about 8 feet away from it. So when you use a wide-angle lens and you step back from the scene, then you don't get the distortion. Same thing here. This is a wide-angle lens and I'm including a lot of background and a lot of foreground subject. But because I'm not very close to this rock, in this case I'm probably about 40 feet away, it almost appears as if I'm using a normal lens. Here I'm a little bit closer, And again, you can see some distortion occurring from the wide-angle lens. The bend in the ceiling, the bend in the floor, nothing seems to be quite straight. And in this shot of the mud, I'm somewhat close to it, but I don't have a really wide-angle lens on. This is probably about a 30 millimeter lens, and I can see that the background is fairly large and this is fairly big, but there doesn't seem to be a distortion in the relationship between the two. Includes more background while making it appear smaller. So we're actually seeing more of the background with a wide-angle lens. Here, all these trees are stretching out very far to my left and very far to my right. But in comparison to this seems very large, and I'm only seeing a small section of the foreground, but a large section of the background. And same thing here. This tree is just overwhelming these mountains, and these mountains in the background seem to be very small in comparison to the trees in the foreground. So we're seeing a lot of background, but it's much smaller. They also create an illusion of greater than normal expanse. So here I'm really not all that far from this distant mountain, but the daisies look bigger and it just looks like this meadow and pond go on forever, when in actuality it's really not that far away. Same thing here, a lot of expanse. Because I'm seeing so much of this background, it just looks like this is incredibly wide and miles and miles and miles away from me. And again, it's not too far away, it's fairly close. Alright, in this image we're seeing the dock, and I'm relatively close to the dock, probably about 30 feet away. But because it's a wide-angle lens, I'm seeing a lot of the mountains to the left and a lot of the mountains to the right. And in this case, the boats don't seem distorted. They actually seem fairly normal. So depending on how you use your wide-angle lens, it can look like normal, or it can really distort and look like a wide-angle lens. Very deep depth of field. When you're using your wide-angle lens, things are very sharp from front to back without having to always stop down to f/22. So here in this case, this is about 1.5 feet from the front of my lens now, and this mountain is several miles away, and the wide-angle lens has an easy time getting it all sharp. Same thing here. This is about 1 foot from my lens, and I have from front to back all the way sharp. In this image, I might even be a little bit closer. This is probably about 1 foot or maybe even less than 1 foot. And in the distance here, everything is absolutely tack sharp. So when you're looking for maximum depth of field, you can turn to your wide-angle lens. Telephoto lenses are really just the opposite. They exaggerate the size of the background rather than the foreground. And they include less of the background while making it appear larger, which is just the opposite of the wide angle. It tends to compress space rather than expand it. And it's got very shallow depth of field. All right, we'll start with exaggerating the size of your background. Here, look at this tiny, tiny little tree in comparison to this very large mountain in the background. If I'd have shot this with a wide-angle lens, it would feel very differently. But in this case, the background is getting exaggerated. Same thing with this mountain scene. This is one of the tallest peaks in the lower 48, and it does seem really large in comparison to the foreground. Look at the height difference. And this was about a 200 millimeter lens. Includes less background while making it appear larger. So if I was to shoot with a 50 millimeter lens, this scene would look something like this. I'm seeing a lot of the background, and the background seems pretty small by comparison to the foreground. Shoot with a long lens, and the background seems larger, and you see a lot less of it. I can't see anything off to the left and anything off to the right. Compresses space. Here in this shot, this close hillside and this are about a mile away, And yet when you look at it through this image, they seem like they're stacked right on top of one another. In this aspen forest, it looks like the trees are growing about a foot apart. In actuality, they're not. There's quite a bit of distance in between these aspens. Here in Death Valley, scale is a very difficult thing to get a grip on in any case. But here, this is a very, very long distance, and the telephoto lens just compresses it all into one space. Here's a couple different shots with longer focal length, and it keeps getting longer as we go along. Take notice of the distance between the tracks and the background here. The background seems very, very large, and the foreground seems small. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And again, the background seems very big again compared to this, but we're including more of the foreground now. And now we're starting to really lose depth of field because I've zoomed in even further. This is at 300 millimeters now. All right, now we're just focused on the tracks. By their very nature, longer focal length lenses have a shallow depth of field. This means only a narrow plane of the image is going to become sharp. This image shows an extremely narrow depth of field. Only the leaves of this flower are sharp. The green background is so unfocused that it's turned into a solid color. There's no separation at all. But in reality, it was a field of grass and other flowers, and there was a lot going on back there. But it becomes so out of focus with the longer telephoto lens that it all blends into one solid color. In this image of my niece, you can see the sharpness begin to fall off on the fence. The part of the fence that's at the same plane as her face, which is right here, is sharp. But the depth of field falls off as it recedes further and further away from that single plane of sharpness. Shallow depth of field is common in portraiture. Areas of sharp focus, like this model's face, will draw the eye, while we tend to ignore the areas that are fuzzy or unsharp, like the forest in the back. In this portrait, the forest, if it was all sharp, it would be very conflicting with the model's face, and you would spend less time looking at her and more time trying to draw the connection between the two, or being drawn by all the contrast. So by leaving her sharp and this out of focus, we're able to pay more attention to the model herself. So normal lenses fall directly in the middle of wide and telephoto lenses. They have little or no exaggeration of foreground objects, and this means you get a more natural size relationship between the two. And they produce about an average amount of depth of field. In this shot of the guitar, even though I'm fairly close, the head does not dwarf the body in the background, which would be the case if I was to shoot it with a wide-angle lens. You could see that the depth of field falls off pretty well, kind of behaving like a longer lens in this case because I'm so close to the guitar head. Here, the foreground trees seem small in respect to the mountains in the background. This is very much what it would look like if you were standing at the same spot. Again, in this image of San Francisco, the buildings in the front and the buildings in the back seem to have a natural size relationship. This is what it would look like if you were standing there. If I was using a telephoto lens, then these buildings in the back would greatly enlarge. These buildings in the front would shrink. Be careful using the normal lens in portraiture, however. You can use it with great success in getting full body or head and shoulder shots, as you can see here. But if you want to come in close just to frame in the face, you're going to start to get a little unwanted distortion of the facial features. So for up close images, like if you wanted to just frame just the face in, consider using a telephoto lens, something 100 millimeters or a 150 or 185 or 200 millimeter lens. That way you won't get a distortion of the facial features. Average amounts of depth of field. Again, if the wide-angle lenses give a lot of depth of field and longer lenses give us shallow depth of field, it makes sense that the normal lenses fall somewhere in the middle. This means we can usually get everything sharp from front to back, but we may have to try a little bit. In this shot I needed to stop down to f16 to get the foreground and background sharp. The waterfall in the front here is about 10 feet from me, and so it's kind of close, and I couldn't rely on somewhere around f8 to get it all sharp. This image was a little bit easier because the bricks are not 10 feet from me, they are probably 100 feet from me. So they're closer to the same plane as the building. Everything's at a distance, and so at f8 I was able to get the whole scene in completely sharp. Keeping your f-stop in the middle range of approximately f8, you will get your foreground sharp, but the background might be a little out of focus. Again, this all depends on how close you are to the subject, but this image was made with a 50mm lens, and you can see there's just a little bit of fuzziness in the background. We can still tell that they're trees, but they're not quite sharp, and it adds enough separation between our foreground subjects and our background subjects. And again, when we are taking portraits of people, it is nice to have the background a little out of focus, as in this image and the previous. So this was shot at about f8, and we keep our foreground subjects nice and sharp, and the background is out of focus, and this keeps our eye moving to the subjects in the front. That's exactly where we want them to be. Alright, now let's look at the same scene with different lenses. We'll start with a wide-angle lens in Yosemite. Here, the rock is fairly large because we're using a wide-angle lens and we're coming fairly close to the rock itself, and it actually dwarfs the size of Half Dome in the background. And of course we know the mountain is obviously much, much larger than the rock itself, but that's not the way the lens makes it appear. So therefore, we're telling our viewer that the rock and this foreground area are very important, and this becomes very much a secondary subject. As we start to zoom out though, and go to a 40mm focal length, the rock starts to get a little bit smaller, the mountain gets a little bit bigger. Now I'm having to back up to keep this same framing of the shot, and now I'm at a 70mm lens, and again the background is getting larger, foreground is getting smaller, until we come to an 85mm lens. And here you can see now Half Dome is substantial, and the rocks in the front are downplayed a little bit. Much different than the feeling we got with the 17mm lens in the beginning. Same thing here. We'll use Half Dome again and this small tree to look at the size comparison of foreground and background objects. 24, the tree seems very large. As a matter of fact, it's almost twice as big as the mountain itself. But as we start to zoom out, get to a 55, now the mountain's bigger, tree is smaller, and up to the 85 again. Now look at the tiny size of the tree in comparison to the mountain. So the idea is what are you trying to portray in your image? What are you trying to magnify and bring focus to? This is obviously much more about the mountain, whereas the first image was much more about the tree. Now let's see what happens when we take the same scene and use the same lens, but just vary our distance to the subject. Here, 17mm, we're kind of close, and the rocks are a little bit smaller than the waterfall themselves. But as we start to get closer, the rocks begin to get larger. And now the rocks themselves are significantly grown in size in comparison to the waterfall. The waterfall in the background actually does stay the same size. So let's go through these again. Let's look at this. This time I want you to watch from here to here, right to left. We're still including the same amount of background, and the waterfall doesn't change in size, but just watch how our foreground changes. Getting a little bit closer, we can still see from this rock to this rock. Waterfall's the same size, but these rocks are now bigger. Move in again, even closer, and now we're still able to see from side to side, but now the rocks seem much larger. So in many cases, enlarging your foreground subject with a wide-angle lens just means moving in a lot closer. Okay, here in this shot, we've got a fairly large arch, and we can see very little to the right and left of it with our 70mm lens, and we're just framing in this glass affair. Let's start to move a little bit closer to the subject, and at the same time we'll widen up our lens. We'll go from a 70 to a 50, and of course, to keep the framing the same, I now have to move forward a little bit. And now I can see a little bit more of this glass, and it's getting bigger. The arch is getting smaller, and we're starting to see more on the outsides of it. Down to a 28, now we can see all these columns are starting to come in, and this is just dominating the frame down here below. All the way to a 16. Now this is taking up a full 2/3 of the frame from top to bottom, and we can see the extension of the building on either side. Notice how the wide-angle lens is starting to splay out these columns and make them seem unstraight, and of course in reality they are quite straight. That's another problem associated with the wide-angle lens. Let's look at this again by coming in close with a 16mm. This time I'm stepping in even closer, and look how we're actually looking down into the glass now. Alright, so we start back here. The lens is the same size, 16mm, but I move up a little bit and step in closer, and it changes even again. The background remains the same, the foreground changes in size. Now let's take a look at what happens with perspective. What I'm going to do in this is I'm going to frame up from the bottom of the light pole to the top of the hedgerow here just above the statue, and I'm going to get longer and longer as I continue through the series. With the 17mm lens to get this framing, I need to be actually very close to the light pole, so I'm actually looking down into the pool itself. But when I keep the same framing and use a 40mm lens, I have to back up. As I back up, I'm no longer looking down into the pool any longer, but I'm looking more across the pool. But again, same framing from the top of the hedgerow to the bottom of the light pole. And then when you get out to a 100mm lens, now you can't even tell that there's a pool in here very close. And we're just looking straight through this stuff to the background. So we've got 3 compositions here that are the same composition, but using 3 different lenses. And you have 3 distinct 3 different feelings to the images. Alright, looking at the church. Again, the 17mm lens is distorting our perspective, and this time it's splaying our lines in like this because we're looking up at the church itself. The stairs in the front seem very large in comparison to the doors and the entryway here. Step back a little bit, use a 40mm lens, and things are starting to come more into a normal type of perspective. Now I've had to back up significantly to get the same framing with the 100mm lens, and you can see now how much larger and taller the church seems than the stairs themselves, and our lines are very straight, and they're no longer splayed out. Now in this scene we can see how much is actually included when you're using a normal lens or a wide-angle lens. Here I've got the blue building in the background on one side, I've got a red fence on the other side, and I'm going to keep the framing the same of this vase and the flower, send it out to about 300mm, and now you can see this green bush. That green bush is actually this one here, very small. So 50mm including all of this background, but when we zoom in and we use a 300, we're seeing far less of the background, and we're better able to simplify just the foreground and exclude all the extraneous stuff in the background. So upcoming in section 6, we're going to look at depth of field and shutter speed in composition.